The views and opinions expressed on the Nova Society are those of the panelists and guests and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of the Phoenix Research Institute or any institution which any panel member is associated. Reproduction or dissemination other than for the purpose of education or information without the express written permission of the Phoenix Research Institute or Nova Society Media is strictly prohibited.
I'd like to welcome everyone back to the Nova Society. I'm your host, Dr. Brooklyn Ann Weldon, and I'm here with my panel, Dr. Scott Gershwer and Dr. Mark Bound. Today, our panel will answer more listener emails. We have Mark, who hails from Ann Arbor, Michigan, brought up an interesting topic with a question about Israel. It appears that Israel is prepared to go into full war mode, and Israel is showing little interest in what the rest of the world or even their own allies are thinking. Is this a good idea, or do you think that this attitude is more media hype?
Thank you for the question. Okay, yeah, good. I think it's a good question. Do you mind if I start, Mark?
Oh, please.
So let me first say that I think the best revenge against Iran is getting back to that deal with Saudi Arabia that sparked the 10/7 attacks in the first place. Because now I don't think Iran has the ability to call on Hezbollah or Hamas to stop that. And this is a unique period in Israel's history where they can actually get this done, normalize relations with the major power in the Arab world and the Muslim world, and strike a deal without firing a gun to proceed with, first the normalization and then a pathway to citizenship for the Palestinian people on what will be negotiated land in the West Bank and Gaza. We'll definitely have to cut out Hamas and the other terrorist groups. I saw Condoleezza Rice on an interview with Firing Line this weekend, and she was asked and answered that in retrospect, it wasn't a good idea to allow Hamas to run for office anyway. And there had been a long principle in democracy called ballots or bullets, where if you're a terrorist group and you've used violence, you do not get to run for office. It's why the IRA and Sinn Féin separated themselves, and there was a political arm of the Irish Republic that was able to negotiate and be legitimately political rather than a terrorist organization or a freedom fighter organization, whatever you want to call it. Same thing would apply. Now, Condoleezza Rice is the person who allowed that to happen. So for her to make this admission was, I think, pretty big. She kind of did it with a smile, but it was a major mistake on the part of the George W. Bush White House to allow that vote to go on the way it did. So no more Hamas, no more PLO, no more ISIS, no more Hezbollah, no more Houthis. These groups have had their say. It has not worked well for their people, and their people are suffering now because of their actions. And again, the best thing for Israel to do is not fire a single missile or another bullet, but complete this deal with Saudi Arabia. Now, will they do that or not? I do not know. And I believe that Netanyahu will probably want to say that this is a rough neighborhood, and if you're not the toughest guy around, you're going to be a patsy, and they're going to consider you weak. My definition of strength is a little bit different than his, and my recommendation stands that this is the best path forward. That would be the thumb in the eye of Iran that they could not recover from, and this is the perfect time to do it.
And I would completely agree with that. If Netanyahu would get on board with it, I think that's an excellent strategy. Like you, Scott, I have very little faith. Netanyahu just did not seem enamored by this deal with the Saudis. That was not something that he was overly interested in. But to the first part of the question, are the Israelis prepared for total war, and do they not care what the rest of the world thinks and what their allies think? I would say, yeah. I think it's probably gotten to that point in time where the Israelis are saying, you make us do this with one hand behind our back. If this was Washington being attacked and not Tel Aviv, if this was, Berlin or Paris or London, and the rest of the world said to us, well, listen, we want you to deal with this, but we want you to fight with one hand tied behind your back. I don't think any one of those nations would agree to that. We didn't ask that of the Ukrainians. when they're battling with the Russians. So, yeah, I think the Israelis at this point in time are beginning to, as Scott said, we're going to show that we're the toughest guy in the neighborhood, and don't mess with us. And the rest of the world, all your diplomacy has not worked, and it's time to, missiles are still being shot at our people. Now they're using drones. I saw that they used drones against an IDF post. I mean, we cannot continue to ask the Israelis to fight with one hand behind their back. We have got to allow them to defend themselves. Yes, it would be great if they did take the path of, we're going to really stick a thumb in the eye of the Iranians, and we're going to make this deal with the Saudis. I'm not sure that the current government in Israel really is on board with that. They say it. I mean, Netanyahu may say it, but to me, it's very iffy. But I would totally agree with Scott's assessment and the recommendation. This is your opportunity. This is a huge opportunity. Take it. It will not require you doing very, very much. Now, will it stop Hezbollah? I don't know if it will. But once again, then let's let Israel use all of their capabilities to defend themselves, as we would expect for any other nation. On 9/11, and New York City was attacked, we didn't hold back. We didn't care what the rest of the world thought. We were going to deal with this in our own way, and we were going to deal with it, although we did deal with it badly, because once again, we are probably the one country that is the best at actually causing ourselves to fight with one hand behind our back. But I don't think that you can ask a country like Israel, in the neighborhood that they're in the situation they're in the political and religious climate they're in, to say, well, no, wait a minute, let's talk a little bit more. Let's keep talking, guys. That's perfectly fine. Keep doing your thing. But do not hinder Israel in protecting itself.
So then I have a couple of questions then to add on to that. Then if continuing diplomacy also means escalation, what might that look like? What are your thoughts on the possibility or the probability that in one of the discussions that Mr. Trump has had with Prime Minister Netanyahu, Trump has asked him to forego any kind of peace agreement until after the election?
Well, first of all, there's a law against that. And I think that's, and I think that's going to be right. And that's going to be brought up, especially when it comes to the Russians, because, it's citizen Trump now. It's not. So I think that's going to come up. But even during the two great wars, World War I and World War II, even during Vietnam, there was always negotiation. Diplomacy doesn't just stop just because of escalation. As a matter of fact, escalation has a tendency to cause diplomacy to move a little bit more swiftly. There are many reports of, during World War II, people in Germany, high up in Germany, attempting to speak with the United States, attempting to speak with the Britons. World War I, there was an outreach to President Wilson by the Germans, looking for an amnesty, looking for a cease of hostilities. Because, again, the hostilities were getting pretty hot and heavy, and the Germans understood the position that they were in. So just because Israel ramps up and is allowed to deal with this in the fashion that they seem to feel is the right way, it does not mean diplomacy stops. Diplomacy still continues, because in the end, it's either complete capitulation or it's a diplomatic capitulation, but it's got to be one or the other. And a lot of times, if you really look at the history of wars, in many times it's been diplomatic capitulation.
Right, but only because the other power felt it could not continue. Certainly in World War II, there was nothing left really for Germany to continue with.
Correct. But even before that, months before that, outreaches were being made. Diplomacy always existed.
That's true, yes.
Yeah, you're going to have a point in time where one power can't continue the fight because they've been soundly defeated. There's, as is the case with Germany in World War II. But that diplomacy that was going on behind the scenes had an awful lot to do with what happened after that military capitulation. It was that diplomacy that basically got Germany back on its feet. It's what got Japan back on its feet. That still has to exist. To just leave a complete void, say like in southern Lebanon where Hezbollah is, to leave a void there is one of the worst things that an outcome of a war can have, where you have nothing. You have no government. You have no. It's almost equally as bad as occupation. Occupation is a terrible idea, because not only do you have to take care of your own, you have to take care of the area that you've occupied. So leaving that void only allows for maybe something worse to come to power, and now you're dealing with something worse than what you started out with. So diplomacy, as I say, diplomacy does not in any way stop just because of escalation.
Scott, any further thoughts? What your thoughts are on whether he may possibly have violated the Logan Act and talking with Netanyahu and asking him to forego any ceasefire until after the presidential election, and also what your thoughts are on if, in defending itself and continuing to defend itself, Israel continues to see the need to escalate because it's continuing to be attacked, like by drones and so on and so forth, while diplomacy continues, and for how long you think that might be sustainable.
On the first part, yes, there's no doubt in my mind that Trump has committed violations of the Logan Act many times. He's recently been revealed to have spoken with Vladimir Putin and actually kicked people out of the room so he could speak with him privately. And he has also hosted other world leaders at Mar-a-Lago, many of them simply wanting to hedge their bets because they're supporting one way or another the current administration and its rightful successor, but also and they need to hedge that bet. But I do think Netanyahu and Trump have had a good relationship, and that Netanyahu may be sitting there hoping that Trump is reelected so that he can go back to his status quo, which is trading blows until the end of history, basically. And I don't see that being a viable ending to this, because there's no end to it. It just continues on. The better move is the one that I brought up earlier: normalize relations with Saudi Arabia and the other Muslim Arab nations. Further isolate Iran at this point. Their proxies, Israel has done an amazing job of decimating their proxies. The Houthis are still out there. That's another situation, but the more immediate need was on their borders, and their borders, means Hamas and Hezbollah. They've done a very good job, I think, of decimating that threat. And now they don't have to worry so much about Iran and all the trouble that Iran can cause. The better approach would be one to lead to peace. And Saudi Arabia could possibly put pressure on Hamas, disband, or I'm not really sure what the end game for the people who are alive still in Hamas, but the end of the hostilities, and a pathway to peace is still the best answer for Israel. The only solution to this issue that's been going on for over 100 years now is a two-state solution. So the sooner you get to two states, the more likely that you're going to have a more lasting peace. I think at this point, Israel has proven that they can get to anybody at any time they want to. And that it may be hubris on my part to suggest this, but if they wanted to take out the Ayatollah of Iran, I believe they have the means to do it. They told Nasrallah, you know what, we're tired of you and we're coming after you, and they got him. Now, that's a lot easier than going after a guy in Tehran, but they went and they got a guy in Tehran. So, there's leaks in the Iranian system. Somebody gave up Hania in Tehran and told the Israelis where the building was that he was going to be living in and how to smuggle a bomb into that building to be detonated at the time of their choosing. I don't think that the world, certainly not the Arab world and certainly not the Iranian world, should underestimate Israel's capabilities. That this is the perfect moment from strength to make this deal. So you say, well, can you trust them? I'm sorry, folks, but trust is not a concept in foreign relations. It just doesn't apply. And the proof of that is that, the revelation that we spied on Angela Merkel's phone, right, was an embarrassing admission that Obama had to make to her, the Prime Minister of Germany, that, yeah, we spy on our enemies and we spy on our friends and we don't trust anybody. So there's, the idea of trust is just a ridiculous amateurish term that people use. There is no trust. There will never be any trust. And you've got to make sure that you understand what's at stake here. And I think that what's at stake is going to be whether we want a Middle East that lives in peace and prosperity, an amazing amount of prosperity, or whether you want to just continue the status quo. Netanyahu's been all about the status quo. He had no solution to the problem that he has. He has no solutions. Trump hasn't provided him with any solutions. Changing the sign on on two buildings, swapping the consulate for the embassy is not a solution to anything. And Trump has been singularly bad for Israel, in my opinion. And Netanyahu has allowed him to be so because they're basically birds of a feather. So that's my long answer to your very simple question, I think.
Mark, would you like to add anything?
No, I think that about sums it up.
Well, good. So thank you, Mike from Ann Arbor, and I hope that we have answered your question, or that Scott and Mark have answered your question. And thank you both, and thank you again to all our listeners, and we hope to see you again next time on the Nova Society. Take care, everyone.
So that's all the time we have for today's episode. The Nova Society is a production of the Phoenix Research Institute. We'd like to thank our sponsor for this episode, the Journal of Interdisciplinary Conflict Science. The JCIS is an open journal for upcoming scholars. The JCIS is currently accepting article submissions on an ongoing basis. The JCIS is a publication of Nova Works, a scholarly depository at Nova Southeastern University. A link to the journal is in our description. We'd also like to thank our podcast partners, Buzzsprout, who hosts the Nova Society, Audacity, who is our editing partner, and Podkite, who does all of our analytics. We'd also like to thank iHeartRadio, where people get their music and podcasts, Apple iTunes, the largest source for music and podcasts on the internet, Spotify, the most popular source for the Nova Society. The Nova Society is available on all these and other quality platforms mentioned in our description. We'd also like to thank our listeners. Without you, the Nova Society would not be possible. If you have a comment, a question, or would like to be a guest on the Nova Society, we can be reached at nova.society.podcast@gmail.com. Always remember, the power of society is knowledge. So for Dr. Scott Gershwer, Dr. Brooklyn Ann Weldon, Dr. Priscilla Hobbs, and all of us here at the Nova Society, I'm Dr. Mark Bound. Be well, and we hope to see you again next time.